All right, people, as promised, here is my TOK essay plan from, what is it? What was that stupid prompt? The first prompt, the first title, as they say. So I'm going to go through it. I didn't write out the essay. I didn't make paragraphs, but I kind of picked out some examples, and I'll talk about what I will talk about. You can't steal my ideas unless it's something that I have already given you in class. So, yeah. That's that. So, Title 1 was Can There Be Knowledge That Is Independent of Culture? Discussed with reference to mathematics and one other area of knowledge. One other area of knowledge. I hate this prompt because to me in general, culture has always been, like how it says culture had always been, like, I don't know, like I'm narrating my life or something. Culture has always been kind of a nebulous concept to me. I hate this question. I don't really like talking about culture in an academic sense. I feel like there's a lot of different definitions of it. I'm not an anthropologist. I guess I just lack the expertise. So, as a result of that, I just don't like prompts that deal with it. It's not that I don't like culture. Sorry, okay, I'm going way out of it. It's not that I don't like culture. I just don't like talking about academic setting. But that's what you wanted, so that's what you got. So breaking down the prompt here. Where's the pen? Make sure this works. There we go. Good. Perfect. Breaking down the prompt. Oh, crud. What did I do? Okay, good. So in my introduction, I'll probably have some kind of funsy quote that reminds me of something, but I got to break down what culture is. I don't want to do the Merriam-Webster or Cambridge Dictionary definition. That's kind of, I don't know, it's like a millennial soccer playing Instagram predictable type of thing. So culture, to me, the way I would like to define it is the beliefs and or way of life of a group of people, group being the operant word here. I think group could be local, national, regional, it could be familial. It kind of really depends. So I'm gonna abuse that. I am going to use group in various different ways, hopefully, throughout this. Also, you can maybe talk about material versus non-material culture. So material culture being like the things that you can see and tangibly touch from a culture, like clothing and architecture, things like that, versus non-material like language and customs and rituals, things like that. Personal, local, national, like I said, different types of culture. Knowledge, I'm actually, a lot of times I would actually maybe talk about like a way of using knowledge or defining knowledge potentially. I think that just saying justified true belief is a little overdone. But in this case, I decided it would be better to not define knowledge specifically, but I would kind of state that it can be different things. So I would say that knowledge, to have knowledge, you can have procedural knowledge, like how to do something, theoretical knowledge, which is more like ideas, empirical knowledge, which is observation, so knowledge you gain from observation or personal experience, personal knowledge, which is your own knowledge, or shared knowledge, which is part of a epistemic community. So culture, knowledge, kind of get those things down. And then also, what does it mean to have dependent versus independent? So how can knowledge be independent of culture? How can it be dependent? And what I would say is, to me, what I think that means is this prompt is asking me, can there be knowledge without culture or absent of culture, or not having cultural values built into it, or not being influenced by the culture or impacted by the culture? So basically, I'm going to say, can there be knowledge without culture, absent of culture? That's how I'm going to use dependent versus independent. So that's like my setup. Those are the major things that I need to get out of the way in my introduction. Hopefully make it a little more artistic in terms of my linguistic attributes, but that's where I'm going. For my framework, or like kind of how I am going to set up the essay and what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about how knowledge will be used or defined in various ways throughout this. So I'm going to talk about historical knowledge, mathematical knowledge, procedural knowledge in mathematics, methodological knowledge in history, things like that. And I'm not going to list all of them that I'm going to do, but I'm just going to kind of say, hey, I'm going to talk about knowledge in various ways. I'm going to define it a little bit differently depending on the situation contextually, and here are a couple of the ways I'm going to do that. I'm going to use mathematics, obviously, as an area of knowledge. I'm gonna use history obviously as an area. It's not obviously, sorry. I picked history. I was kind of going back and forth. I had a lot of stuff related to human sciences that I wanted to bring in my psychology class. We recently did an article about emotion and culture, and actually how there's terms, linguistic terms for emotion in other cultures that aren't directly translated into English. There's no word for them. Thought about that a little bit, but anyway, ultimately I decided to stick with history because I felt like it gave me more to draw upon and more implications and comparisons to do. Also, I'm going to discuss not the knowledge as it exists, or so not just the knowledge as it exists, because I think we think of knowledge, we think of like facts in your head. That's declarative knowledge, but I'm going to look at the methodology of gaining knowledge. I'm going to talk about the application of knowledge and the dissemination or the spread. I don't know why I have so many parentheses there. The spread of knowledge. So how does it go from personal to shared? Which is our final unit when we come back from break. Yay! That's it. All right, so I broke down my working thesis or claim so that I could kind of have like a my different sections kind of spread out. So typically, if you've had me in any other classes where we do writing, I talk about how I have this formula for thesis statements that I really, really like. However, I tried to jam this kind of prompt answer into that, and it didn't really work. So, sometimes you got to be flexible. So there's 4 big things that I kind of want to say. First off, I think it's kind of a given, and that's why they chose this mathematics for this question, that mathematics is seen by a lot of people as completely objective and universal, and therefore it's independent of the cultural lens from which it was produced. So I'm going to kind of talk about why people might think that, and try to give an example. I'm going to try to give an example. It's actually harder than you think. A lot of people, I think, they thought that it was easy to think of independent knowledge in mathematics, but I actually think it was a little more difficult than you might have originally thought. However, culture can be impacted or can impact the way in which mathematical knowledge is obtained and applied. So I'm going to talk about how culture influences methodology of mathematics and possibly the application of mathematics, not just what the math knowledge is. And then my next section, my second discussion, is going to be about history. I know I talked about how if I were to do an essay, I would kind of go back and forth. I don't know, maybe it's like new parent brain. I decided the best way to do this one was just to split them up and maybe draw some links as I go. Historical knowledge is subject to a variety of knowledge issues regarding perspective, many of which are culturally specific. I'm not going to do a graduate dissertation on history as an AOK. I'm going to focus on perspective and talk about how culture is one of those perspectives. And then culture can also be deterministic. So a little callback to linguistic determinism, but I'm actually going to, I don't know if this is actual term, but I'm going to kind of talk about what I would colloquially discuss as cultural determinism. So how your culture can define your world or what you can understand within historical knowledge and possibly mathematical knowledge. So culture can also be deterministic of the way in which historical knowledge is shared and disseminated as well. So I don't have a lot. So I'll get to this later. I don't have a lot where I'm going to talk about or argue that historical knowledge is not culturally dependent or that there is historical knowledge that's independent of culture. And that's okay, I think. You don't need to have claim, counterclaim, claim, counterclaim. You just need to look at various perspectives. So I feel like I did an okay job with that in the time that I put into this. So you can judge. History will judge me. Anyway, moving on. So discussion 1, basically my big idea here is that mathematics, I'm going to talk about mathematics as objective, but also impacted by the way in which the knowledge is obtained and applied. So it is objective, but it also can be culturally based. So big idea, I would kind of maybe talk in maybe a short paragraph about this. So I kind of give this as like a placeholder, but I kind of have like a lead in to my examples here where I kind of maybe give a little bit of an overview. So basically I'd have a paragraph-ish where I'd explain why mathematics is considered objective. So like, what is mathematics? And this is a key thing. I don't see a lot of people talk about this, but at its core, mathematics all goes back to the proof. You're using numbers, obviously, but it goes back to the proof, which is we need to be able to have axiomatic, using axioms and principles, deductive reasoning to go through premise, conclusion. Like that is mathematics. It is deductive reasoning at its finest. And I think that's why people consider it objective. But not all deductive reasoning is actually factual or valid or sound. So we might talk about that a little bit. And then also, I'm going to say that, yeah, just saying that just saying that we have axiomatic math. I think it's a narrowly tailored definition of mathematical knowledge. I think there's a lot of other mathematical knowledge that you can have. Again, you can have your procedural mathematical knowledge, procedural. You can have your more theoretical mathematical knowledge. That's what that says. You can have shared personal knowledge, things like that. So my first example, I'm going to go a little philosophical on you because this is kind of like what I like to do. But I'm going to talk about Platonic or Platonism or Platonistic mathematics, which goes back to Plato. And this was related to his theory of forms. So he had this idea that there are things that exist in reality, the forms that are objective, and that's just the way that they are. And according to Platonic math is an example of that there are mathematical principles that just are the way that they are, and I can give some examples of those. So I don't have a specific article really to represent here, but I would talk about how there's certain mathematical principles that just kind of exist in nature. And are just kind of accepted. So the Fibonacci sequence would be a good example, or it's also sometimes related to what's called the golden ratio or a fractal. You've probably seen it. It's like something that looks like a spiral, kind of works on itself. But that's seen in nature. It's studied in science. It kind of is what I think Plato would refer to as a form. It's objective. It's not really dependent on culture. The fact that it is there. It's a sense perception, really, is what it boils down to. So I would talk about that a little bit. There's something else that just came to my mind and I was going to say it. Oh, I don't know, something like the Pythagorean theorem. So like how geometric shapes exist in space, things like that would be like forms. So I would talk a little bit about that. That's kind of my philosophy, my very philosophical part of this. The rest of these are very practical in my opinion. So that would be my first example where I'm actually going to do the argument that there is mathematical knowledge that is independent of culture. They are forms, they're sense perception based, they're very axiomatic. My second one, though, I had a couple different things that I wanted to talk about with this one, and I guess just being a teacher, what came to my mind was the development of personal knowledge in mathematics. So how do we share knowledge and build our own personal knowledge of mathematics? I took a mathematical teaching course or teaching mathematical thinking course over the summer at Boise State. It was a lot about like what are different ways that you can think about math and help students understand math. And I found this article from Education Week, which was about culturally responsive pedagogy in mathematics. So basically teaching in ways that align with the culture of the students and cultural diversity and helping them understand knowledge that way. And it was a really great example of how mathematics can be culturally dependent. And it's about how you build the knowledge. The knowledge that you're building is going to be determined by your culture, depending on how you are taught and how you build that knowledge. So that's this is my more of what you typically think of as quote unquote knowledge. And then this is going to be more of my methodology or my practical standpoint. Okay, so two examples. One's a claim, then I kind of have a counterclaim or a different perspective. What I like to do is probably make some implications or connections there. So I'll kind of talk about how the scope of mathematics, using that knowledge language, the scope of mathematics is very axiomatic, which means we have very like these truths that we follow, but its methodology can be more culturally specific. And then I'm not going to go into depth with these examples, but I would probably say something about how like this could lead to cultural variation in the applications of and sharing of knowledge. So I might talk about how statistics are applied differently in different cultures. Maybe talk about how mathematics is used in architecture in different cultures, and whether or not that's dependent or independent. So that's just more of my implication. It's more of like the significance. I'm not going to go into depth about that example. So again, discussion one, example two. I've got my explanation. I've got some points and counterpoints or some various perspectives, and it ties back to the framework of knowledge. I'm using that language of methods, scope, not really perspective, but perspectives in there. Yeah, so that's mathematics for you. So next I'm going to go into history, and my big idea here is that historical knowledge is perspective driven while also culturally deterministic or determined kind of by culture. So my big idea or my lead in, again, this is going to be about like a paragraph or so, maybe a little short paragraph. It's going to be kind of transitory or giving a transition. So I'll kind of explain the role of perspective, especially cultural perspective in the development of historical knowledge, maybe give like an anecdote, example, maybe of like language or translation of primary sources. I don't know, something like that, just showed I know what I'm talking about. But here are my two big examples. I'm going to draw upon the historical perspectives article, like the Man on the Clapham Orbus, or Omnibus, I should say, where they talk about how you think about what a reasonable person would think about history, but like what is a reasonable person? That's kind of culturally specific, potentially. As well as, and I put an asterisk by it because I know not all of you are in IB history, but a lot of IB history is talking about how do we develop historical knowledge and what are our interpretations and our different perspectives, ways of thinking about it, how do we evaluate sources, things like that. So I'm probably going to bring in some of that information as I talk about these things. So my first example actually goes back to a book that I actually got in college that I use in IB history, and it's about the methods and skills of history. And one of the chapters is about how history is interpretive and it's based on interpretation. So I'm going to maybe take a specific example of how history has been written, okay? Not different perspectives on an event. And that is a key thing. This is not events necessarily, not events. They will be about events because that's history. But I'm not going to say like, here's an event that happened and here's how one side looks at it and how another side looks at it. I'm going to really talk about how the history has been written and how the knowledge has been like built about a certain subject. One good example is I have different, I have a book, for example, where I have different excerpts about different events from different countries and how they look at the same like how their textbooks cover certain events and like what the narrative is that they try, the story, if you will, they try to build. So one I have is like South Korean and North Korean textbooks about the Korean War. I could look at how museums in Vietnam portray the Vietnam War versus how in America you've got like the Vietnam Wall for the soldiers and how we portray Vietnam, documentaries, things like that. So I don't know, something interpretive that I'm going to talk about that could be related to perspective driven and how that relates to culture potentially. My second example is going to be about shared historical knowledge and its impact on culture, or the impact of culture on sharing knowledge. So I had that example very recently about how China has like a committee every few decades, I think it is, and they actually like rewrite the narrative of history. They're rewriting of historical narratives. I think that's a great example of something that is political, but also part of Chinese culture that is not really yet American. But I might contrast that a little bit with U.S. issues currently, because there's a lot of political discussion, and it's not as I think it is kind of cultural. I mean, you're going to have regional cultures, you're going to have political culture within the United States, and just the fact that the United States has to try to deal with its own narrative of history and the issue of that's called, I'm going to quote it because there's different definitions of this, but critical race theory and history and how history is being taught, revisionist perspectives, things like that, and how that's created kind of what we would call a quote unquote culture war within the US. So I think that's culturally deterministic. And then I kind of maybe might write in like a yeah, but, because this is something I was thinking, are we then going to just deny that there are truly facts in history, that there can actually be facts, kind of like Plato said? Are there mathematical forms of history, or are we just saying that that doesn't exist, basically? If you hear Finian, I apologize. And I would say no. I would say no. We're not arguing that there are not truly facts in history that are independent of culture. One thing that comes to mind quickly is this thing called big history, which is where they take a very broad view, a very big lens of history. They kind of zoom out and they bring in a lot of like natural science aspects and try to think about like the beginning of history from like the Big Bang, and then just what are the like indisputable developments that have occurred. Maybe I talk a couple sentences about that, but I would say I'm not saying there aren't truly facts in history. I'm just saying that our way of reconstructing the past has limitations. Culture is one of those determinants that determines our perspective and our limitations, much like language would be another one, which again is something that's part of culture. couple connections or implications here. I would maybe tie it into linguistic determination or determinism, like that philosophical concept. How can we potentially extract this concept from history as an AOK, maybe loop it back into mathematics? How do we see maybe this type of determinism in mathematics? A really great example I could think of is Arabic numbering systems versus Roman numerals back in the day and the limitations of the Roman Empire for not having zeros or fractions or things like that. I think about different systems of measurement, which is kind of mathematical, but how that causes issues in disseminating knowledge. So making those connections between the two AOKs can be helpful as well. After that, I'm just going to kind of wrap things up and conclude. So I addressed some implications somewhat in my body paragraph. I kind of planned that out to do that. So it's kind of time for one more thing to really like hammer it home and kind of wrap things up and maybe give something else to kind of think about in terms of the broader significance. So the biggest takeaway I would say is that there is a division between what is true from a sense perception standpoint, i.e., Platonic forms or like the reality that we have versus what we construct and the knowledge we perceive as real or objective. So I think there is a gap, and that's been demonstrated, or I've given some examples of that. And as far as that goes, culture can act as a method of sharing knowledge, especially in relation to perspective and methodology across an epistemic community. So I kind of talked about that with mathematics, perspective on history. However, culture places limitations on the scope of our knowledge, especially when we view certain aspects of an area of knowledge as strictly universal or objective. So, and then I'll kind of go back to my thesis statements. I have my 4 big points because I want to also show that I'm answering the question. So I don't want to just go off on a tangent here, but these are me trying to kind of give like a broader broader significance here. So broader significance of why this like matters, what I've kind of learned basically. I always tell students like with extended essays or TOK essays, at the end you really just want to tell the reader like what did you learn from this process. This is very exploratory in nature, so what did you learn? And so obviously my answer to the prompt is like, yeah, it depends. It depends. But I would say that there may be some information that is truly not based on culture, but most knowledge is dependent on culture. I guess is how I would say it. Again, it's a discuss prompt. It means that I have to kind of give like a even-handed investigation, so I don't need to take a direct to what extent stance on the prompt.